All right, deep divers, buckle up, because today we're we're heading underground, literally, to explore the world of Soviet blast shelters. We're going to
Mm.
uncover what they were, how they were built, and what they can tell us about the Soviet mindset during the Cold War.
Yeah, it's a fascinating glimpse into a world where nuclear war, you know, felt like a very real possibility. And the Soviets took extraordinary measures to prepare for it.
Right, and our main guide for this deep dive is a 1978 research report prepared for the U.S. Defense Civil Preparedness Agency. And just to be clear up front, we're here to understand this historical program, not to endorse any political stance,
Yeah.
okay? We're simply diving into the facts and the fascinating logic behind this massive undertaking.
And it was massive. We're not just talking about, backyard fallout shelters.
Yeah.
The Soviet program was designed to protect a significant portion of the population from the full impact of a nuclear attack.
Okay, so let's unpack this. I understand that the Soviet approach to civil defense kind of evolved over time. Didn't they initially focus on evacuating people?
Yeah, in the early decades after World War II, the emphasis was on pre-attack evacuation. The idea was to move people out of major cities, potential targets, to safer areas.
That makes sense on the surface, but trying to evacuate millions of people in a crisis must have been a logistical nightmare.
Exactly. And as the Cold War intensified and the threat of a surprise nuclear attack became more prominent, the Soviets realized that evacuation might not be feasible.
So they shifted their focus to shelters.
Precisely. By the 1970s, shelters became the cornerstone of their civil defense strategy. They aimed to build enough shelters to protect a large portion of the urban population.
So instead of running, they were digging in. Was this purely a defensive move, or was there a strategic element to it as well?
It was likely both. A 1973 statement by Colonel General Altunin, the head of Soviet civil defense, sheds light on this shift. He called civil defense a decisive strategic factor for wartime survival.
So they saw it as more than just protecting civilians. They believed it could actually influence the outcome of a war.
Yes, a robust shelter system could allow the Soviet Union to absorb a nuclear attack, minimize casualties, and potentially maintain some level of functionality, even in the aftermath.
That's a pretty chilling thought. But I suppose it makes sense from their perspective. If they could survive the initial attack, they could theoretically retaliate or even rebuild.
Precisely. And a massive evacuation would give away their intentions,
Hmm.
telegraphing their awareness of an impending attack.
Right, that would go against their doctrine of surprise and could escalate the situation. So they opted for a system that offered a level of protection without tipping their hand.
Okay, so they decided to build these shelters.
Mhm.
But where do you even begin with a project of this scale?
They started with an incredibly detailed classification system, categorizing shelters based on their purpose, protection level, capacity, location, ventilation, and even when they were built.
Wow, that's a lot of categories. Sounds like they were taking this pretty seriously.
They had 5 classes of shelter hardness, which essentially refers to how much blast pressure they could withstand. Okay, so a harder shelter could withstand a closer blast or a more powerful weapon.
Exactly. And some of these shelters were designed to withstand extreme pressures, upwards of 142 pounds per square inch, or psi. To put that in perspective, a typical hurricane might generate wind pressures of around 50 psi.
Wow, that's intense. So what did these shelters actually look like? Were they just concrete boxes buried underground?
They varied widely in design, but they all shared a common goal: to protect occupants from the immediate effects of a nuclear blast, including the blast wave, heat, and radiation.
And they weren't messing around with the materials, were they?
Not at all. They used high-grade concrete, reinforced with tons of steel. Some reports mention concrete with a compression ratio of up to 8,520 psi.
That's some seriously tough concrete. I'm guessing a regular jackhammer wouldn't stand a chance.
Not a chance. These shelters were built to last. And within this system, there were even more specialized shelters, built for the Soviet elite and key personnel, shrouded in a level of secrecy. That adds another layer of intrigue to this whole program.
Ah, yes. The shelters for the top brass. Tell me more about these elite shelters. What set them apart from the shelters intended for the general public?
Well, these elite shelters were built to an even higher standard. They were designated super hard and extra hard, designed to withstand incredible blast pressures, potentially even a direct hit.
So while the average citizen was huddled in a communal shelter, the Soviet leaders had their own private bunkers. Sounds like something out of a dystopian novel.
It does raise questions about their priorities, doesn't it? And the secrecy surrounding these elite shelters is intriguing. Information about them is scarce, often coming from anecdotal accounts rather than official documents.
So what do we know about them? Were they like underground palaces?
Not exactly palaces,
Hmm?
but certainly built to a much higher standard. Sources suggest walls and roofs several meters thick, possibly even lined with lead, for added radiation protection. And while the exact locations were kept secret, some reports point to underground complexes beneath government buildings, military installations, and even remote locations outside major cities.
Wow. It's fascinating to think about the lengths they went to ensure the survival of their leadership. But what about the average citizen? What kind of shelters would they have been in?
There were two main types of shelters designed for the general public: detached shelters and basement shelters.
Okay, so detached shelters were separate structures built away from other buildings.
Yes, often found in factory yards or open spaces. They offered some advantages, like avoiding debris from collapsing buildings and potentially accommodating larger groups of people. But they were also more expensive to build and required more space.
That makes sense. So basement shelters were the more common option.
Yes, they were more practical and cost-effective. They utilized existing structures, requiring less digging and construction. Imagine a reinforced basement with thick concrete walls and a reinforced roof, designed to withstand the weight of a collapsing building.
So they were essentially strengthening existing basements to create these shelters.
Exactly. They would often add a layer of sand or slag between the shelter roof and the floor above for added protection against radiation and the heat from fires. It's a testament to their resourcefulness and ingenuity.
Speaking of resourcefulness, I've heard about these dual-purpose shelters. Can you explain what those were?
The Soviets were very pragmatic. They realized they couldn't build dedicated shelters for every purpose. So they came up with the concept of dual-purpose shelters. These were spaces designed to serve a regular function in peacetime, but could be quickly converted into shelters in an emergency.
Okay, so like a subway station that could also function as a shelter.
Exactly. Underground garages, pedestrian walkways, basement restaurants with reinforced ceilings and walls. They were all incorporated into the system.
Wow, it's like they were weaving civil defense into the very fabric of their cities. But what about situations where there weren't any suitable existing structures? What did they do then?
That's where rapidly erected shelters came in. These were designed for situations where time was of the essence.
So if a crisis erupted and they needed to get shelters up quickly.
Yes. They used prefabricated units,
Right.
concrete conduits, sewer blocks, large concrete blocks that could be assembled rapidly, sometimes in under 72 hours. Using mechanized equipment, it was like a giant Lego set for civil defense.
And these weren't just thrown together haphazardly, right? They still had to offer a certain level of protection.
Absolutely. They featured right-angle entrances to deflect blast waves and doors designed to withstand significant pressure. And importantly, they offered radiation protection factors, ranging from 400 to 1,000.
Okay, for those of us who aren't nuclear physicists, can you explain what that means?
A radiation protection factor indicates how much the radiation dose is reduced inside the shelter compared to outside. So a protection factor of 400 means that someone inside the shelter would receive 400 times less radiation than someone exposed outside.
So these rapidly erected shelters, while maybe not as robust as some of the permanent structures, could still offer significant protection from radiation. But not every shelter was meant to withstand a direct hit from a nuclear bomb, right?
That's correct. They also built simpler radiation covers, designed primarily for fallout protection. These were typically less robust structures, like adapted basements or dugouts, meant to shield people from the lingering radiation after an attack.
So they had a whole spectrum of shelter types, depending on the level of protection needed and the time available to build them. But I have to wonder, even in the most well-constructed shelter, wouldn't it be incredibly challenging to survive underground, potentially for weeks?
That brings us to one of the most critical and often overlooked aspects of shelter design: habitability. The Soviets realized that surviving a nuclear attack wasn't just about having a sturdy shelter, but also ensuring that the people inside could actually live in those shelters.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So what did they do to make these shelters habitable?
They had to address several key challenges: temperature and humidity control, air quality, water and food supplies, sanitation, and even psychological well-being. And they came up with some ingenious solutions.
Let's start with the air. I can only imagine how stuffy and stale it would get inside a sealed shelter. How did they handle ventilation?
They recognized that maintaining breathable air was crucial, especially considering the potential for radioactive dust, toxic gases from fires, and even chemical contamination. They developed two main types of ventilation systems: factory-made equipment and improvised systems.
Let's start with the high-tech stuff. What did their factory-made systems look like?
These systems use factory-produced filters and fans, designed for both pure air ventilation
Yeah.
and filter ventilation.
Yeah.
Pure air ventilation involved drawing in outside air, passing it through a series of filters to remove dust and other contaminants, and then circulate it throughout the shelter.
And what about filter ventilation? When would they use that?
This mode was essential when the outside air was contaminated. They used specialized filters to remove carbon monoxide and other toxic gases, as well as heat exchanges, to cool the incoming air, which would be crucial if there were fires raging outside.
So they had a plan for dealing with those specific threats. Were there concerns about the availability of these specialized filters in a wartime scenario?
There were likely concerns about supply chains and logistics, but the Soviets were also adept at improvisation. They developed simpler, more readily available filtration systems as well.
Okay, let's talk about those improvised systems. How did they manage to filter the air without factory-made equipment?
They got incredibly creative. Imagine shelters with ventilation systems, built from sand, gravel, and even fabric.
Wait, they filtered the air with sand? How did that work?
They would dig pits and fill them with layers of sand, gravel, and slag, creating effective filters for removing radioactive dust. They also relied on manual fans or designs that used natural airflow to circulate the air.
That's amazing. They really were masters of resourcefulness. But clean air is only one part of the equation. What about other basic needs? How did they plan to keep people fed, hydrated, and, well, sane in these confined spaces?
That's where things get really interesting. Let's delve into those aspects in the next part of our deep dive.
Welcome back, deep divers. We're picking up right where we left off, deep beneath the surface, exploring the world of Soviet blast shelters. Last time we talked about ventilation and the Soviets' dedication to ensuring breathable air in these underground spaces. But fresh air is only one piece of the survival puzzle, right?
Absolutely. They had to consider all aspects of habitability: food, water, sanitation, even the psychological impact of being confined underground, potentially for weeks.
Let's talk about the basics first. Food and water. How did they plan to keep people fed and hydrated in these shelters?
Well, the sources we've been examining are surprisingly detailed about these logistical challenges. They recommended a minimum daily water requirement of 3 to 4 liters per person, just for drinking, and another 4 liters for hygiene for their entire stay. And larger shelters are supposed to have even more in case of fire.
So they weren't just thinking about quenching thirst, they were thinking about hygiene and fire safety too.
That's right. It highlights their meticulous planning. As for food, citizens were advised to bring several days' worth of non-perishable items.
Yeah.
Biscuits, canned goods, dried fruit, things that wouldn't require cooking.
Makes sense. But even with those supplies, I imagine food would become scarce pretty quickly.
Yes, and they acknowledged that. There were plans to supplement those personal supplies with deliveries from nearby stores or restaurants. Though, how well that would work in a chaotic post-attack environment is debatable.
That's a good point. Okay, so they had plans for water and food, at least in theory. What about sanitation? That's not something you want to overlook in a crowded shelter.
Definitely not. They had guidelines for toilet facilities, typically one toilet for every 50 to 75 people in permanent shelters. But in those rapidly erected shelters we talked about earlier, well, it was often just buckets.
Yikes. It's not ideal. I'm starting to see why they preferred those permanent structures.
Yeah. And remember, these shelters were designed to hold people for days, possibly weeks. The sources even mentioned psychological preparation for shelter life, acknowledging the stress, fear, and potential for conflict in such cramped, isolated conditions.
That's a side of this we haven't really touched on, the human element. It couldn't have been easy being crammed into these spaces, not knowing what was happening above ground.
Exactly. And that's where the role of those shelter teams, which we mentioned earlier, becomes crucial. They weren't just there to operate the ventilation systems. They were responsible for maintaining order, providing first aid, and offering psychological support.
So they were more like community leaders almost, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy and hope in a truly abnormal situation. It really adds a whole other layer of complexity to this program.
It does. It shows that the Soviets understood that surviving a nuclear attack wasn't just about physical protection. It was about mental and social resilience as well.
Okay, so we've talked about the different types of shelters, how they were built, how they were ventilated, and even the challenges of making them livable. But how many of these shelters did the Soviets actually build? Was this just a plan on paper? Or did they truly invest in creating this nationwide network?
That's a question historians are still trying to answer definitively. The Soviets, unsurprisingly, were tight-lipped about the exact figures. But based on available evidence, including reports from people who lived through this era, and declassified intelligence reports, we can get a sense of the scale of this program.
So what are we talking about? Millions of shelter spaces.
By 1975, it's estimated they had enough space for roughly 60% of their urban population in cities considered potential targets. And remember, this was after they had already prioritized shelters for key personnel
Industries.
and government facilities.
That's a staggering number. It really underscores how seriously they were taking this threat. But all of this must have come at a tremendous cost, right?
Absolutely. We're talking about a massive infrastructure project spanning decades.
Yeah.
Estimates suggest the program cost somewhere between 21 to 51.2 billion rubles over a 20-year period, depending on varying construction costs.
Wow. That's a huge investment. And I imagine it wasn't without its critics, even within the Soviet system.
You're right. Some argued that the resources could be better spent on improving living standards or strengthening conventional military forces. But the leadership remained committed to civil defense, viewing it as an integral part of their national security strategy.
So they saw this as an existential threat, something worth sacrificing for. Even if it meant economic hardship or other trade-offs, it's a sobering reminder of how the Cold War shaped their worldview.
It certainly is. And while those massive concrete shelters may seem like relics of a bygone era, the principles behind them, resilience, resourcefulness, a commitment to protecting citizens, are surprisingly relevant today, even if the threats we face have evolved.
That's a good segue into a thought that's been brewing in my mind. Throughout this deep dive, you know those Soviet shelters were built for a very specific threat, nuclear war. But how do those lessons translate to the threats we face in the 21st century?
That's an important question. We're not facing the same existential threat of nuclear annihilation. That defined the Cold War. But there are plenty of other dangers lurking out there, both natural and man-made.
Pandemics, natural disasters, cyber attacks, terrorism, the list goes on. And those threats can be just as disruptive and devastating as a nuclear bomb, even if they manifest in different ways.
Exactly. And they often require a similar level of preparedness and societal resilience.
So what's the modern equivalent of a Soviet blast shelter? What can we learn from their approach, even if we're not digging underground bunkers?
It's not about building physical structures anymore. It's about building a different kind of resilience, a resilience rooted in knowledge, adaptability, and community preparedness.
Okay, so less about concrete and steel, and more about information, skills, and social connections.
Exactly. It's about having emergency plans in place, knowing how to access reliable information, having basic supplies on hand, and being able to connect with and support your community.
It's about shifting from a mindset of passive protection to one of active preparedness, recognizing that we all have a role to play in building a safer and more resilient world.
Precisely. And that preparedness
Yeah.
in itself is a powerful thing. It gives us a sense of agency, control, and hope in a world that can often feel chaotic and unpredictable. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit of resilience and innovation can shine through.
That's a powerful message to end on. We've journeyed from the depths of Soviet blast shelters to the front lines of modern preparedness, and along the way, we've uncovered some unexpected parallels and some powerful lessons. Thank you for joining us on this chilling but ultimately enlightening deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay prepared.